This is Payment System Broadcast. It's our 19th session. We're going to start in a couple of seconds, I would say. Thank you very much for joining. In the meantime, let me do some of our usual housekeeping. My name is Carlos Leon. I'm the moderator of this series of Payment System Broadcasts. Today, we're going to have a session which is related to modernizing payment settlement engines. And as we're going to introduce our speakers today, we have Baltazar Rodriguez and Animesh Gosh. Please be aware that we're going to have a more or less 45-minute discussion with our speakers, with our guest speakers. Then at the end of the session, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes for question and answers. Those questions, please send them via the widget that is included in WebEx. That's where we're going to check the questions and we're going to select those that makes more sense for our discussion. So let's go to the next slide. So as I mentioned before, we're having two speakers today, Baltazar Rodriguez, who is the project lead for FuSSE from the BIS Innovation Hub Toronto. And we're also having Animesh Gosh, who is the founder and CEO of CurrencyNetwork.io. I will allow each of our guest speakers to introduce themselves. And please include any disclaimer that you want to include in your presentation. So who wants to start? And thank you both for being here.
Oh, everyone, I'll start. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me. My name is Baltazar Rodriguez, and I'm currently an advisor with the BIS Innovation Hub, and also currently working as the acting head of the Toronto Innovation Center. And also I've been leading Project FuSSE for a while. The usual disclaimer says that whatever I say here is mostly my own opinion and my own view of the project and not necessarily BIS policy. And what else can I share about me? Well, I'm an all-around technology geek. I've been in computing ever since I was 9 years old. I'm about to turn 58, so that tells you about how long I've been involved in this. And that has taken me all over the place. I've been the CTO for the Mexican Tax Administration, where I pretty much lost all of my friends. No one loves a taxman. Then I worked for IBM for nearly 8 years as a senior architect. And then the last 2 years of my life, I've been spending within the BIS Innovation Hub, mostly trying to think about ways in which we can leverage technology in order to improve financial stability and basically to prepare the financial sector for the future, which is quite an exciting job, I might add.
That's a great intro, Baltazar. Animesh.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm based out of London. So in my career, last more than 20 years, I've been involved in large-scale payment and banking infrastructure. So mainly designing and architecting these large-scale infrastructures. I still love coding, so that's why I'm in FuSSE. Balta and BIS colleagues talked about the FuSSE vision, are very much inspired by that. And that's why we came to contribute to this project. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both for being here with us today. So I'm going to introduce very quickly what we're going to speak about. I already mentioned that the title or the name of our broadcast today is Modernizing Payment Settlement Engines. And we're going to talk specifically about what Animesh and Baltazar already mentioned, which is Project FuSSE, which is a project which is led by the BIS Innovation Hub in collaboration with the IDB, with the Inter-American Development Bank, which its aim is to revolutionize financial market infrastructure. Perhaps a good way of describing it, and I think that Baltazar already mentioned something like this, it's about modernizing and some kind of future-proofing the operations of payment systems in the region. So I will not take more time. I think that I will let Baltazar and Animesh to talk a little bit more than I do here. So once again, thank you both for being here. So I think that we can start with with our questions. So perhaps the first one will go to Baltazar. So you bring a lot of experience about central banking and digital infrastructure. So what can you, how do you intersect or how do you articulate that experience and the overview that you have for Project FuSSE and its primary objectives in modernizing payment settlement engines?
Okay, so when we started Project FuSSE and we went through our ideation phase, one of the things that we did is we started reaching out to different central banks and looking at the way in which the industry was moving along. And we also brought in a bit of knowledge of what was happening out there in the complete technological ecosystem. And we started seeing a couple of problem areas, if you will, or opportunities that we could leverage into making financial market infrastructures future-proof, or at least ready for the foreseeable future. And some of the major aspects that started popping up was, for example, a very large increase in the amount of demand that we have. If you look, for example, at the number of transactions that we support on FMIs, they went up the roof after the pandemic. And the thing is, this will probably keep on increasing. And that is one of the reasons why we started building FuSSE. We wanted to build something that would enable FMIs to modernize themselves in order to provide that sort of high scalability and high security elements that you would need to have within an FMI. Now, I should state that FuSSE is not necessarily a payment system or a payment engine. FuSSE actually stands for a fully scalable settlement engine. So the emphasis in here is on settlement. And this also had to do a lot with a bit of the IT background that we brought into the problem. You see, as we started seeing issues around payments, we saw that some of those issues were shared across different financial market infrastructures. And instead of having to focusing on building a payment engine, we decided on building a settlement engine that could be leveraged by different FMIs in order to modernize. So as we did this, we set up really important targets in terms of scalability. So I would say that our initial target was around 10,000 transactions per second, which we've already achieved. Our second target was to do this on commodity-based hardware so that this could be within the reach of jurisdictions of all sizes. We wanted this to be able to scale out easily or scale down in terms of what you needed also, again, to try and achieve that degree of flexibility. But we also wanted to make sure that we could resist some of the latest advancements in technology. So, for example, we have quantum computing as an up-and-coming subject. And that is definitely a threat to, for example, traditional cryptography and traditional security. Thus, we also wanted to ensure that we built into this capabilities in order to have that quantum resistance. And as you mentioned, we partnered up with the Inter-American Development Bank, mostly in order to try and promote the use of FuSSE across the Americas, but they're not our only partners. We are already partnered with Bank of Canada, our host central bank, and right now also in the project, we have welcomed the Central Bank of Chile. So we are actively building a community here. And we do this also with the help of our private sector partners like Animesh, for example. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing right now.
That's great, Baltazar. Animesh, related to this, how do you at CurrencyNetwork align with these modernization efforts that we're seeing or that Baltazar has mentioned?
Yeah, so when we started speaking about FuSSE, back those days in BIS, Innovation Summit, so that the thing inspired us as a team is about building something that doesn't exist. So, for example, if you think about today, we have a system which is quantum resilient, support 10,000 TPS on commodity hardware. It didn't exist until today we built. So that was the inspiring factor. And then we had this background of working with like scalable technologies, for example, Kafka, Cassandra, Redis, this sort of highly scalable open source technologies, running them in the commodity hardware. And then we also worked on various RTGS system, financial messaging. I actually wrote a Swift gateway back those days with empty messaging. So then we are also in my team. I got people who understand deeply PCI DSS, then Basel 3, PSD 2, all sort of thing we have done. So it's a combination of all of the skill set we have. So we thought, okay, if we apply that on the FuSSE, probably we should be able to take FuSSE from the lab to the from lab to reality. Actually, that's what we are trying to do here. So that has been going very well, and I would say, the effort we put in this project, that's really is becoming a product in terms of something that can be used by many jurisdictions, because it's on a commodity hardware, and then it costs low, and then it's modularized. So many jurisdictions can use this product, and then fintech can innovate on top of that. So it's a very interesting project, and that's why we are very keen to work on this.
That's great. Before we jump to the second question, something that perhaps it would be interesting for the audience is to clarify, and I think that Baltazar mentioned this. This is not about payments only. This is about settlement. So settlement is more general, because it's at the end, is like the end of each transaction, and no matter which is the underlying asset at the end, let's call it like this. But I would like I would like to understand: is this related to RTGS only? I mean, large value payment system. Is it related to retail payment systems, fast payment systems, ACH payments? What are like I mean, it's like a horizontal solution for any type of settlement. I think that would be a good thing to get clear.
I would say that yes, in a form it is, because one of the things that pretty much influenced the way in which we were trying to build this from the get-go was the following. As we started analyzing some of the current systems that we do have, we started asking the uncomfortable questions, like why aren't those systems being able to keep up with the speed of demand, or keep up with the evolution in terms of technology? And one of the elements that popped up was the fact that most of those systems that we have were purposely built for one particular market and one particular point of view. So you're only trying to solve payments, or you're only trying to solve security settlement, and you do it for one particular jurisdiction. So what we tried to do was bring in an approach that's more common within the general IT industry, which is build something that is good enough to provide whatever functional aspects you want it to provide, but building in such a way in which it is generic and flexible enough in order for it to fit into different use cases. So actually, I would say that regardless of the fact that our key use case was achieving that high degree of scalability, we wanted to achieve this through a lot of flexibility that could be leveraged into applying the technology and the research that we're doing into different settlement scenarios. So could you use this in order to build, for example, an RTGS? The answer is yes. Can you do this for any other form of payment system? The answer is then again yes. Could you use this, for example, for doing security settlement? And the answer is yes. So basically, any form of settlement that involves a balanced recorded asset, I think it is a good candidate where you can effectively use FuSSE. And actually, that is one of our key design philosophies, to have enough flexibility within the architecture in order to allow end users to actually use this and adapt it to the reality that they have within their jurisdiction and their particular use case.
That's great. I think that clarifies a lot and tells a lot about how broad the application of FuSSE is. So entering the second question, and I'm going to use a word that has been in the in the news for the last 3 or 4 days, which is open source. I'm referring to DeepSeek and all what's happening with NVIDIA and the other ones. This FuSSE is described as an open source solution as well. Also, that is asset agnostic, that is scalable, that is adaptable to the future AI and agent technologies. How does this framework, perhaps the most important is the open source and asset agnostic, how does this framework address the growing demands in today's financial ecosystems, Baltazar?
Okay, let me actually begin the other way around, and we'll get to the open source as this closes up. So, for example, if we look at current demand is already spiking. But you see, that spike in demand that we're seeing has mostly been focused on us, end users, moving over into the digital world after the pandemic. However, if you look at the stuff that's happening out there, this is actively changing, and we're expecting even more demand. Why is this? It's not that we're expecting more end users per se, like you and me. However, we're moving into an age where we're expecting the Internet of Things. We're also moving into an age where we're seeing, for example, a lot of AI, and a part of that discussion having to do with AI is the idea of agentic AI. Basically, AI agents taking decisions and carrying and performing actions on your behalf. So if we think about that, then that means that we're probably expecting a larger degree of end users within this brand new use case, where those end users could actively be devices such as this triggering payments, or an AI agent triggering a payment. So that in itself is already pushing the boundaries in terms of the scope of what we need to achieve in terms of volume. Now, the other thing that we're seeing here is that it doesn't only have to do with that. The other problem that we're facing here is a lack of skilled resources. If you go out there and start knocking on the doors of different central banks, you'll find very bright people, but you will see that, for example, not all of them invest in the same form in terms of developing technological capabilities. And even if you are investing in that, you're limited to the amount of budget that you have at your disposal. So you have a fixed amount of budget that you could use in terms of research. What we wanted to do was to start building around FuSSE a community where we can share this source with, for example, central banks, with the idea not only to give them access to the research that we're doing, but to begin the foundations for building a community of experts across the world where we can actively maintain this infrastructure going down into the future. And it's not just a question of bringing in more hands, which already gives you a lot of network benefit in terms of combining research budgets across the board, but it also allows you to build the local skills that you need in order to support those systems. So this is already focusing on that idea of sharing that source out there as a form of making this project sustainable over time, and also as a way of receiving feedback from the different jurisdictions on what could be improved in terms of the solution. Now, that pretty much takes you only thus far as sharing this with central banks. But when we started this, one of the options that we have as the BIS is not only to share this with central banks or other public sector authorities. We're also evaluating putting this into general open source. Now, that is not something that's currently decided, but it is something that could definitely bring benefit to the equation, especially if you're, for example, a smaller jurisdiction. If you're a smaller jurisdiction, you might not have access to skilled resources out there within your jurisdiction in order to support FuSSE within your local deployment. If we went this down in a full open source approach, then that would mean that private sector partners could also join the project, feed back into the project with brand new code and brand new innovation, going into this in the same way as Linux has been developed over the decades. And by doing this, you're also giving those smaller jurisdictions the possibility of either developing their own skills or contracting those skills from private sector partners that could bring that knowledge into the table. So you see, what we're trying to achieve here is a mix of different technological aspects and different strategic aspects. And the reason why we're doing this is we want to achieve a flexible solution that can address the needs of jurisdictions from all over the world, regardless of their size, regardless of the complexity of the particular use cases that they want to achieve. So I would say that that is the key driver why we wanted to do this open source as well.
That's great, Baltazar. Animesh, from your private sector perspective, how do you see these kind of initiatives like FuSSE influencing the innovation in payment systems and FMIs? And also, and taking into account what Baltazar mentioned, how is the relation of these kind of projects with, for instance, the providers of payment systems from the private sector?
Yeah, so if you think what FuSSE is that it's a foundational building blocks. So we created a foundational building block that's hugely scalable and runs on commodity hardware, which means, and also the current FuSSE build, it does not go into any specific jurisdiction specific, rules or template. It's more like a vanilla. Now, if any of the jurisdictions take on board FuSSE, so firstly, they will save hugely on the cost because it goes in the commodity infrastructure. And then they would have the whole private sector who are there would have the opportunity to build on top of that layer. So, for example, Balta just mentioned about Red Hat. Similar example you can take, like for example, Kafka versus open source Kafka versus Confluent version of Kafka. So if you have these building blocks, and then on top of that, you can have the entire layer, innovated by the private sector. So, for example, AI-driven liquidity optimization that can be implemented on top of that on this FuSSE layer. Then maybe various kind of tokenized asset settlement use cases because FuSSE supports all kind of assets, and the data structure is pretty dynamic. As and when new form of asset comes, you can actually include them. And then from the retail and SME fintech perspective, they can also bring new kind of use cases. Although it's a settlement system, but then it can support up to 10,000 TPS, which means like automatic invoice payments, or even up to the micro payment level. You can settle them in real time. So there are a lot of innovative ideas that could be built on top of these building blocks. That could be the private sector that how they can come into play.
That's great, Animesh. Going to question 3, Baltazar, could you elaborate a little bit more about how FuSSE addresses operational challenges such as liquidity-saving mechanisms that Animesh just mentioned, also about security challenges such as the one that you mentioned about being, FuSSE being quantum resistant?
Okay, sure. So before I address this, I would also like to set a disclaimer here. Basically, FuSSE is not a product per se. It is a work of research, and as research, it still has its own little rough edges and stuff that we still need to add and stuff that we need to improve. This was never intended to be a full product. That is why we want to share this with the community in order to have the community build out the product and build a support structure. Now, that being said, how are we trying to address this moving into the future? Okay, so the first thing that I would like to mention is, for example, quantum resistance. Quantum resistance is a very big threat and something that is coming down the road. So in that respect, when we started, there was still a lot of open discussion on what could achieve quantum resistance. So one of the things that we did is we built in the idea of quantum agility within our system, giving us the flexibility of switching around and turning from one algorithm to the other. That sort of approach that we took for quantum was the same sort of approach that we took to all other pieces of functionality. We wanted to address this with a lot of flexibility in a way in which it would allow us to keep on experimenting and doing our research bit. Okay, so one of the good things actually about that quantum resistance is that when we started analyzing the different quantum algorithms, quantum resistant algorithms out there, and we focused on the crystals family, basically crystals with lithium for electronic signatures, crystals kyber for doing key exchange and doing secure communications. And even though we didn't know that for a fact back when we started, we pretty much chose them for their performance capabilities. Back then, they weren't considered officially as quantum safe algorithms. Now, one of the good things is the NIST came out and has already said that those are quantum safe mechanisms, so that was good. But then also with regards to liquidity, we were focusing mostly on transactional scalability and having this flexibility in terms of our architecture. So in terms of having, let's say, a pure play or laser focus in terms of liquidity management, that really wasn't there from the beginning. So we are currently managing liquidity just by having a very simple netting strategy. Actually, I should also state that the transactional figures that we were mentioning, the 10,000 TPS, those are without netting. If you actually have netting, this could effectively scale up over to hundreds of thousands or millions of transactions per second. But right now, our position in terms of doing liquidity management is fairly simple. Now, that being said, one of the things that we are actively planning on doing as we are reaching the end of this research iteration is that one of the things that we learned is that there are other areas that we want to explore deeper into, and liquidity management is one of those. So one of the things that we're thinking of in terms of a second iteration is to start leveraging other technologies such as, for example, AI, and using AI to try and develop innovative ways and very flexible ways of achieving better performance in terms of liquidity management. So what I would say is not that we didn't consider liquidity management as being important, is back then when we started ideation, we really didn't have a very good grasp of what could be innovation in terms of liquidity management. Now that we have gone through the complete first iteration of Project FuSSE, we've gotten better ideas, and I think this sets up with a very interesting research agenda for a possible second stage for Project FuSSE.
That's great, Baltazar. Animesh, what lessons can you share about how decentralized and blockchain networks could be applied to enhancing security and scalability in this kind of financial market infrastructure modernization projects?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, Carlos. So back those days, I coded a lot with Hyperledger Fabrics, both Hyperledger Fabrics and Ethereum as well. So started with Hyperledger 0.5. And so both public and private blockchain. And now we have to say FuSSE is without blockchain. Now, what are the lessons comes from there? So if you think about private public blockchain, so you got this distributed network. So you got a lot of resiliency and security built into it. And then similarly, even if it's a private blockchain, then again, you've got this, distributed node and you have this consensus mechanism. So distributed architecture is something we picked up, I would say from there. However, if you think about FuSSE, the payment infrastructure is wholly owned by the central bank. So you don't necessarily need a consensus mechanism, and consensus mechanism always, brings overhead. So what we have done, let's say, we kind of built our own blockchain network in some way. I would say, because we are using distributed database like Cassandra. And then on top of that, we've got the distributed memory cache with Redis, and then event-driven architecture we have established with Kafka. So what happens is that this whole distributed system is we created a fault-tolerant system with things like Cassandra has got something eventual consistency. So we created the distributed system without having those consensus overhead. And that's what it makes FuSSE very interesting. So we have this mechanism. If some node fails, it doesn't affect any single transaction at all. And then also we are deploying on this open source AKS. So it kind of it's the system. The whole thing is elastic, right? When we anticipate more loads, the system will automatically create more instances. And also, for example, we have something in our system we call like ledger entry service, and that sometimes needs a lot of transaction to process. So it kind of goes dynamically can expand the number of instances. So to summarize, what we have picked up is the good side, I would say, of these distributed blockchain network into the in building an FMI, which is owned by central bank. And in terms of security, probably FuSSE is one step ahead because, as Balt was mentioning, we are having this quantum set cryptography, which I'm not aware of any blockchain net open source, public blockchain network using so far.
That's great, Animesh. One of the things that are highlighted in the if anyone enters the webpage of Project FuSSE or one of the documents, one of the things that Project FuSSE focuses on it's on financial inclusion. So that's a central theme in the collaboration between BIS and the Inter-American Development Bank. Baltazar, how does FuSSE aim to lower the barriers and enhance financial accessibility for underserved populations, particularly because of the IDB in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Okay, so one of the first things one needs to consider when you're trying to address this whole subject is the fact that financial market infrastructures in general and payment systems in particular should be considered a basic infrastructure of systemic impact and value within a society. Thus, the lack of having good financial market infrastructures or lack of having really efficient payment systems, that will get in the way of your development as a country, as a society, and the development of your citizens. So I think central banks all over the place are aware of that. And particularly, I would say that within emerging economies, this is even more so. Mostly because the lack of that financial inclusion. So building efficient payment networks can help you bring financial products to the underbanked or the underserved community. Now, but as we were mentioning this in the previous questions, there's an additional challenge. And that additional challenge is that whenever you're speaking about jurisdictions that might not be very large or might not have a lot of technical resources or might not even have a very large budget, that is where FuSSE finds its sweet spot. And I think that is one of the key reasons why the IDB looked over at the work that we were doing in the Toronto Center in order for us to start partnering, because we were trying to address the same need, is bring that technology over to the countries that need it the most. But I would say that the benefit doesn't really stop with those smaller countries, or it doesn't even stop with financial inclusion. Because even if you look at developed economies, one of the things that you will find is, yes, they already do have payment networks, but those payment networks might not be as efficient as other offerings. And that ends up adding into the cost of living into whatever country you have. So the basic proposition of building a really efficient FMI by using FuSSE, I think that holds across the board, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but it definitely does resound a lot more over here, mostly because of that lack of financial inclusion. And we also know that not just because of the fact of you bringing the technology, that will fix the problem. Because you can have access to a source code, but if you don't understand it, if you don't get the grasp of how this got designed or how you could leverage it into building that FMI, you basically don't have a solution. So that is the other focus on why we wanted to build this idea of collaboration, both with the IDB, but through the IDB with the central banks, in order for us to develop those skills locally so that those countries can be entirely self-sufficient, which, if you look at it, it is a very important perspective, because if this is a system of systemic importance, you definitely want to keep your sovereignty in check. If this particular system is held by someone else, basically you're putting your economy in someone else's hands. If you don't have the skills locally, you are basically still within a problem. And that is the key reason why we wanted to focus on the idea, not only on building the technology and doing the technological research, but also in terms of developing that community, because it is the community, the one that will actually leverage the advancements that we're building within FuSSE in order to bring them down to earth and to truly go out there and build the products that will serve that underserved community within those countries.
That's great, Baltazar. From the private sector perspective, Animesh, what is the link, or how does the private sector contributes or is willing to contribute to financial inclusion with the goals which are similar to FuSSE project?
You see, think about any country. If a financial, private fintech wants to grow, they're facing few challenges. For example, transaction cost. Like they ultimately do have to do the transaction, and then they have to have a margin out of that. And then they also have the other thing is that onboarding. So a typical PSP in most of the countries, they would do all this checking. It's like going to take 2 to 3 months. So those are like some of the barriers. There are other barriers. So FuSSE kind of while we are developing FuSSE, we kind of put some very clever thoughts on that. So the onboarding, the way we are actually in the development of onboarding at this point of time. So there will be very, very quick onboarding. The PSPs will have a key, and they will be able to send transaction by using QSEP algorithm, and then because it's running on the commodity hardware, the transaction cost becoming very, very low. We haven't actually figured out yet what is the price point, but I think it would be the lowest whatever available in the world today. Well, maybe in the next presentation we can talk about the transaction cost, but those two things, if it comes into picture, then it becomes very easy for the innovators in any country on building a fintech proposition on top of that. And then the third aspect, I would say interoperability. So we are making sure FuSSE is ISO 222 compliant. Inside FuSSE, we have a special way of, I was talking about fault tolerance, so the special way of handling and communicating between the modules. But then the moment if something goes in or goes out, that ISO to 222. So that gives the interoperability. So any private sector want to build something, as long as they follow that messaging standard, they should be able to communicate with FuSSE.
That's great, Animesh. So going to our next question, Baltazar and Animesh, you have already mentioned words such as Internet of Things, AI. How do you expect, or how does this kind of emerging technologies reshape what we're thinking of the financial landscape, and how is FuSSE going to contribute to this? So Baltazar, for you, how does FuSSE prepare financial market infrastructure such as settlement systems to integrate with these new technologies?
Okay, so I mean the argument regarding the increase in terms of demand brought on by AI and IoT, we pretty much already beat to a pulp here. But this also brings in other types of factors, especially if you start combining with other elements that we're seeing out there in the environment. So if you drew a map of the way in which financial market infrastructures operate and how they interact to one another, one of the quirky bits that you will start finding is that on all of those use cases, you always end up having the banks playing a significant role. They're pretty much front and center of everything that we do. So that means that a lot of our use cases center around the idea of having commercial banking out there front and center. And that has been good for a long time. But also, if you start looking at brand new developments and brand new use cases, a lot of them pretty much brought on by the whole blockchain revolution. One of the things that you will see is that there's a very big push for moving that centerpiece from commercial banking all the way over into the end user. So it is having the end user front and center of the brand new use cases, which sounds really good. But if you start thinking about this changes the dynamics of the systems in a very significant way. Because if you were building an FMI and you were interlinking with, I don't know, 200 banks or 200 financial institutions within your jurisdiction, that basically meant that you had 200 users, okay? I mean, you still do have tons of transactions, but it's still 200 users. If we actually achieve this transition from a bank-centric approach into a user-centric approach, then the actual number of users that you will have on your system, it won't be a couple hundred. It could be millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions of users once you start adding in the AI and the IoT. So that meant that systems would also need to start evolving into achieving higher density. Now, I should state that this is only a theory. It's not something that we're actively seeing, but because we were building this with this idea of flexibility in mind, we built it in such a way in which you could support those 200 users with no problem, those 200 financial institutions within your network, but that you could also scale this out into supporting those billions of end users. So that is one of the ways in which we're trying to get to that future. The other thing is that what I would say is it's not only that, it's also that whenever you're speaking about security, gets also a lot more complex once you move from those couple hundred users into the billions of users. The differences in terms of your perspective or your design philosophy, those were a lot of the things that we wanted to ensure that we kept within FuSSE. So the basic idea here was not only to build a really efficient system, but a system that could evolve with the use case as the use case starts evolving. Because one of the things that I could say right now is that even though it would be very stupid for me to try and predict the future, one thing I know about the future is it will probably be very different than what we were envisioning it would be. So the only way of preparing for that is ensuring that you have enough flexibility in order to address the current use cases, but also start evolving with those use cases and go down the route where it seems that they are leading. Okay, so basically what we're trying to do here is give you flexibility and not try to take an opinionated way on how this should be achieved. So it's not like we're actively pressing for end users to have accounts within the central bank, which currently today is not the sort of thing that you would expect to have. But the thing is that you could support the way in which things are right now and the way things could be tomorrow. And that is what I would say is the key for designing stuff in a way in which it can evolve and be flexible enough to address the future needs.
And I think that it has a lot to do, I mean, this flexibility has a lot to do with the modularity that FuSSE has, because as new use cases arise,
Absolutely.
most likely the thing is that you build a new model, put it on top of it, and it will work well.
Precisely.
That's great to hear, Baltazar. Animesh, now that we have entered the topic of the Internet of Things and AI, how or what is the way that FMIs, financial market infrastructures, should tackle the challenge of AI and Internet of Things, and how to have this this smooth integration with settlement systems such as the one that is done with FuSSE?
I think there are three main challenges coming. Of course, it brings opportunity, but then three main challenges. So it's going to be scalability, security, and the third one would be interoperability. So as we already mentioning about the modular architecture, and the way we build is a microservice-based architecture. So we have each function as a module and built on microservice, and then this microservice can grow dynamically on the basis of load in a Kubernetes architecture. So this is not just we are using. There are very large companies who are processing very high volume transaction. It's proven. So so we have taken the lesson from there, And we have put together an architecture that actually can scale horizontally. So over the period of time, as Baltazar was predicting, when this transaction load comes, not necessarily, you have to overhaul the system. Rather, that's you can have the horizontal scalability. You can put more commodity, computer, hardware resources, and then it can grow. So that's how we handle the scalability. And the security, I think I don't want to repeat. We are already talked about it. It's a quantum resistant. And interoperability part is important because as and when there are a lot of different kind of devices are coming into the market, into this ecosystem, how do they interoperate? So that's why there's a different kind of messages. There would be different packs in the ISO messages. So we are cognizant of that, and we are handling those messages. So ISO is something we are very much focusing on to make sure in the new generation FuSSE is always compatible with different kind of devices wherever the transaction comes.
Thank you, Animesh. We're reaching the last question before we enter the questions by the audience. So every time that we do this kind of broadcast, we have like the looking into the future question. So this is like using the crystal ball and your powers to foresee what is happening into the future. So Baltazar, we're going to narrow it to how do you see FuSSE evolving in the short term? What are the next steps for FuSSE? And for Animesh, once again, let's have it right now. So how do you see that the private sector is going to integrate or interoperate with FuSSE in the short term or medium term?
Okay. Well, someone very wise once said that trying to predict the future was a fool's errand, and that's actually what I'm trying to do here, so call me a fool. Okay, so what are my expectations in terms of FuSSE for the future? So I would say that my key expectation is growing community engagement, because the true value of this is not necessarily the research. I mean, the research is a very good chunk of it, but it is the fact of getting that research out there and having it be used by central banks, the public sector, and even eventually the private sector. Okay, so growing community for me would be like the way to go. Now, that being said, and as we're right now gearing up for what could be a second stage of research, which, by the way, still isn't authorized, but some of the ideas that we're toying around with would be, for example, the AI-driven liquidity management, probably the inclusion of additional quantum-resistant mechanisms within our crypto libraries. Also, we're currently supporting virtual payment addresses, but we've already come up with a brand new protocol for building those virtual payment addresses in a way that it can support multiple use cases and in a way in which it could be leveraged to lower the cost of KYC operations across the board. And even though we don't have a blockchain, one of the things that we did love was building on top of some of the basic blockchain tenets, like, for example, a distributed architecture. So we might actually have additional blockchain-inspired elements, such as bringing consensus into the board for particular types of operations, or adding programmability without the need of a blockchain. But if I was pressed to it, I would say that my key goal for the future in order to achieve impact is knowledge development. I want knowledge to be developed across the board, across different jurisdictions, so that we can keep on improving the financial sector together.
Great, Baltazar. Animesh.
It would be helpful if you could just repeat the question for me.
No, it was very simple. I mean, how do you foresee that the private sector is going to interact or to integrate into this FuSSE project in the medium and long term, perhaps?
Yeah, as Balta was explaining, if when the FuSSE become open source, right, then the entire private sector has the opportunity to build on top of that, and that could be massive, right? So so far, whatever the operator in the market, they have some level of architecture based on some technology. Now in FuSSE, we have proven this scalability, cost, and security aspects. So for private sector, they can take these building blocks and then build on top of that. And that could be very much like, I will give you an example. Let's say you have these open source version of Kafka, which is highly scalable. It has got all the aspects you need, but then people normally go with the Confluent version of Kafka because that has got a support structure and that you can actually count on. So think about just if you think just FuSSE, right? If you as a central bank you bring it on board, then you have this thing that who would actually support you, right? And that's kind of an open source thing. And then you need someone really having that knowledge to support you, because payment is actually the backbone of your economy. Like something happens, literally a disaster will happen in that country. So these thing, and so what I'm trying to say is that when the FuSSE actually matures, the private sector would come and then build on top of that various use cases, and they would be able to support FuSSE with their resources, and that would be then could be useful for the central banks and other organizations, because then they would have these assurance that okay, I have something fault tolerant, interoperable, security proof, but then I also have my partner who is supporting.
Good, thank you, Animesh. Let's go to the Q&As. And I'm going to start with one of my own, which is I've heard a lot about security, interoperability, scalability, and obviously introducing AI and especially Internet of Things. Is there a layer for fraud, scams, and other types of threats to the safety and the well-being of the people who, of the end users, which are going to use systems that are going to be developed with FuSSE?
I would say that at this stage, the answer is no, because right now we mostly focus as part of our research in achieving the high scalability and the high security. So fraud prevention wasn't the topic from the get-go. It was considered, and one of the things that we did build into the architecture is the way of interconnecting that into future modules that could be used for doing that. So for example, one of the strawman figures that we have devised around FuSSE is the fact of building supervisory platforms and rule enforcement mechanisms that would allow you to fight fraud. And actually, one of the ideas that is also being shuffled around as we go into research is the possibility of doing, for example, real-time online supervision. So using AI to start scoping out the traffic, seeing the sort of transactions that you have, and then triggering alerts on stuff that have to do with liquidity or with the possibility of fraud or run on the banks. So it is definitely something that we're considering right now, but it is not something that got into the scope of the original research project.
I think that's where FNA and FuSSE overlap or intersect. So that's something that I foresee coming as a new episode of this broadcast when that topic arises. Animesh, something to add to that, or can I go to the next one?
You can go to the next one because
okay.
I don't repeat anything what Baltazar said.
There are several which are rather technical in nature, talking about, for instance, response time and these kind of things, or which is the best algorithm for payment system transactions. But I think those are some questions that could be sent or submit to you privately, perhaps. It's a better
sure.
But there are several general, very interesting questions. And the first one, and let's try to keep it short so we have 5-6 minutes to have a lot of questions. And I want to say that this is perhaps the broadcast in which we have received more cues from the from the audience. First one that I'm going to bring is, what is preventing the mass adoption of DLT and blockchain if results are so good?
So, Balta, do you want me to go? Or?
Go ahead and I'll complement.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned that already, is that so think about the business model first. So if you think about the business model, we are building a payment infrastructure that is wholly owned by the central bank. So you do not have need like a consensus mechanism or somebody validating your transaction and multi-party trust. Those sort of things you do not have in this business case. So that's kind of goes away from the business case perspective. And the second, as I was mentioning, we have taken the best out of the blockchain technologies. In fact, the distributed architecture concept. So if you think about, for example, Hyperledger, you got all the nodes, and then you got these consensus mechanism, which gives you the ability to that irrefutability, all sort of things. But then it actually, because of the consensus, it actually has to sync the database. So actually it slows down. So you cannot achieve the level of TPS what we wanted to achieve using commodity hardware. And on top of that, if we take a blockchain, then we would have another challenge. Okay, so how do we make it to quantum secure? Because they would already have the security encryption, which is probably RSA, in place. So we wanted to build up our own, in terms of firstly from the business perspective, and the second one from the technology perspective. We thought we could do better with technologies like Kafka, Cassandra, Redis, and on top of the Kubernetes infrastructure. Baltazar, do you want?
Well, the other thing that I would add in here, and this is pretty much echoing a bit of what Animesh already mentioned, is as engineers, we have a problem. And actually, that problem was mentioned by Mark Twain. He said that to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that is one of the key problems that we did see with blockchain. And by the way, I used to lead a lot of our blockchain developments back in IBM Mexico when I used to work over at IBM. But one of the key problems that I saw was that people were so enamored with the technology of blockchain that they wanted to use blockchain all over the place, even where it didn't make any sense. So all solutions should always be strategically and business driven. And technology always comes last. Technology is basically there to support your business goals. And this echoes a bit of what Animesh was already looking into. And you see, we come from a central banking point of view. Central banking point of view does not rely on distributed governance. It is centralized governance. So we're bringing distributed architecture, but with a centralized governance point of view. Now, that does not mean that we reject everything having to do with distribution or consensus. And that is also one of the reasons why we want to add that consensus module, because we still do see, even within this centralized governance use cases, the need for a certain amount of consensus. So if you think about, for example, cross-border payments or FMI transactions, where you might have a payment system interacting with a securities trading platform. You need that form of consensus in order to ensure that those two systems agree on a single version of the truth. But it's not really consensus-based management. Those FMIs are still centrally managed. What you're doing is you're leveraging consensus where it actually makes sense in terms of the business case. That should be always our key driver. Not just for FuSSE, for any sort of financial project that we do.
That's great, Baltazar and Animesh. One quick question. It was directed to Baltazar. How soon do you foresee central banks adopting post-quantum cryptography standards as a need?
Wow. Okay, that's a good one, because that depends a lot on your actual point of view in terms of being a consumer or a developer of technology. I would say that in terms of pure risk, central banks should probably be already focusing on doing that and getting ready for that, for those quantum attacks, because it's not a question of if or if not, it is a question of when. And the thing with technology is it has this nasty way of surprising you with brand new developments just when you least expect it. So the thing is, central banks should actively be doing this. Now, and with this, I would like to add the fact that due to the way in which FuSSE is built and its modularity, you might not be interested as an FMI operator or as a central bank in using FuSSE just now. But I would definitely commend you to start looking into your quantum vulnerabilities and then leveraging FuSSE in order to reuse those quantum safe libraries, which are already there and they're available to be shared with central banks and with private sector institutions. So if they reach out to the BIS, we'll give them access to that source code so that they can effectively start doing that migration today. And as we keep on adding additional quantum safe functionality into this, we will just make this stuff even stronger. So it's not necessarily a key driver that you want to revamp a current FMI. If you are aware about that particular risk, you can definitely leverage the research that we've done in FuSSE by just deploying that crypto library.
That's great. I'll have the last question, and this is a very interesting for FuSSE project itself. It's how can institutions which are interested in contributing or using the FuSSE open source library, how do they engage with the project?
Okay, I would say, for example, if you come from the public sector or if you come in, for example, from central bank, just reach out to the BIS. And actually, if you look for Project FuSSE, you'll find there one of our partial deliverables, and you'll find our email address there. Or if not, you can always contact me at baltazar.rodriguez@bisih.org. You can contact me, and we'll get the wheels moving in order to try and get you involved. If you also need other form of assistance and you're within Latin America, for example, you might need assistance in terms of driving your governance or your policy into how to modernize a payment system, go ahead, reach out to the Inter-American Development Bank. They'll give you that assistance, and they will also bring in FuSSE across. So there are multiple ways of interacting. And hopefully, if we get authorization to go full open source and sharing out there with the community, I would definitely love everyone getting involved with this and adding new functionality, new use cases, and a lot of feedback into the stuff that we should be addressing in future releases.
That's great. I think that we have reached the end of the broadcast. Animesh, Baltazar, thank you very much. It has been a very interesting conversation, a very in fact, as I just mentioned, there is a lot of questions still pending in the queue widget, in the questions widget, but I'm sure that the people can submit those questions to you or perhaps in some event. So once again, Baltazar, Animesh, thank you very much for joining us today. Just to let you know that this was the payment system broadcast number 19. We're going to have more broadcast announcements coming in the following weeks. So please stay tuned, for instance, in LinkedIn and in other social media. We're going to share the next ones. Again, Baltazar, Animesh, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.